Most consider Dellacroce the heir apparent to Gambino, and he was on law enforcement radars as one of the most important figures in organized crime. The New York mob's inner circle greatly admired Neil and looked up to him.
Neil was the godfather of Mulberry Street and demonstrated tremendous generosity to the local Italian residents. He gave money to those experiencing hard times and had an open-door policy where anybody who had problems could come to him. In return, they were to keep an eye on the neighborhood and to immediately let him know about any suspicious people lurking in the area, any cars that seemed out of place, or any strangers asking questions. This security network proved to be an effective system which impeded investigators for years.
In January of 1973, Dellacroce would go on trial for his tax evasion charges, and 2 months later, on March 12, 1973, he would be sentenced to 5 years in prison. He began serving out his sentence at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Neil's influence and connections afforded him special privileges in jail, which allowed him to still exert control over the crews that were under him. Consigliere Joseph N. Gallo would also step in to aid the incarcerated Dellacroce and Agent Gambino in overseeing the family's operations. Soon there would be an investigation into the exclusive accommodations that Dellacroce received during his prison terms.
In 1974, business was booming for the Gambinos, and the crews that Neil Dellacroce was overseeing was earning the family vast amounts of income through various different illegal operations.
The crews that Neil was overseeing were comprised of dozens of capos and soldiers. He had numerous big earners under him who were involved in everything from labor unions and construction to loan sharking and gambling.
One of those earners was a Gambino soldier under Dellacroce named Anthony Plata, known as Tony Plate. Plate was initially operating out of the Bronx and Yonkers area, but had migrated his loan sharking business down to Miami. He left a bookie named Charles Charlie Bear Calise in charge of his Bronx rackets and was receiving his monthly share.
Plate had gotten into a dispute with Calise over a loan sharking debt, and Plate also believed that Calise was cooperating with the FBI. So Plate conferred with his direct superior Dellacroce, who was still incarcerated at the time, and the decision was made to eliminate Calise. Soon afterwards, on July 7, 1974, Calise was found dead in the backseat of a car in a parking lot in Rockland County, New York, with 2 bullets through his eyes, 2 through his ears, and 1 through his mouth. This was an underworld message that he had seen too much, heard too much, and talked too much. Federal sources would later confirm that Calise was in fact an FBI informant. After serving a little over 3 years of his 5-year sentence, in August of 1976, Dellacroce was released from Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, but he would be sent directly to Rikers Island in New York to serve out a 6-month state sentence for contempt of grand jury. In 1976, while boss Carlo Gambino was ailing and nearing death, he named his successor to take over the Gambinos. Most people expected that person to be Neil Dellacroce, but instead he named his cousin and brother-in-law Paul Castellano as the next boss of the Gambino family.
Gambino's decision made many of the family members furious, as they saw Castellano as more of a businessman than a gangster and therefore unfit for the position. By now, Dellacroce headed several crews and had the backing of many members, but being the true mafia loyalist that he was, Dellacroce accepted Gambino's decision with no resistance. In order to diffuse the building tension, Gambino announced that Dellacroce's position as underboss would be retained under Castellano's leadership, with Joseph N. Gallo serving as the consigliere.
On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino passed away. The torch was now officially passed to Paul Castellano as the leader of the Gambinos. The 62-year-old Dellacroce, who was incarcerated when the announcement of the new boss was made, was in poor health and needed his gallbladder removed. He was released from Rikers Island on Thanksgiving Day, 1976, and would soon return to his command at the Ravenite under the leadership of Paul Castellano.
Neil had long-standing rules for the Ravenite. Men were to dress well at the club, no drunkenness was permitted on the premises, and uniformed patrolling officers were to be treated with courtesy at all times.
After returning from another jail stint in 1977, John Gotti was initiated as a made man into the Gambino family, and not long after this he would be promoted to replace Carmine Fatico as capo of the Bergen crew. Gotti and his crew reported directly to Dellacroce, and Gotti was regarded as Dellacroce's protege.
Castellano recognized Dellacroce's strengths and allowed him to lead a growing number of crews. However, in doing so, Castellano had inadvertently created a split within the family. Soon, two factions in the Gambino family would emerge, those loyal to Castellano and those loyal to Dellacroce. Gambino had forbade drug dealing in the family as punishable by death, and Castellano had kept the same rule in place when he took over.
Neil had purchased a home in Staten Island, which was just a short distance from boss Paul Castellano's mansion in Toad Hill, which was known as the White House. Dellacroce alternated between his Staten Island home and an apartment in Little Italy. Neil's son Armand, nicknamed Buddy, had followed his father into organized crime and was part of the Gambino family. By now, Neil was spending most of his time with his mistress, Rosemary Connolly, with whom he had fathered more children with. One of Neil's daughters had been dating a 21-year-old man named Joe LaPiccolo, who was a small-time criminal. It's alleged that LaPiccolo had physically assaulted her. On May 22, 1978, LaPiccolo's dead body was found in a Staten Island cemetery. He had been beaten, strangled, burned, and stabbed over 25 times. After several years of an intense probe by law enforcement, in May of 1979, Neil Dellacroce and Tony Plate were charged in an 8-count criminal indictment. Dellacroce was arraigned in the U.S. District Court in Brooklyn and was freed on a $500,000 personal bond. Plate, who was arrested in Fort Lauderdale, was released on $125,000 in bonds. Due to the information provided to the NYPD by the former acting boss of the Los Angeles crime family turned informant, Jimmy the Weasel Fradiano, Dellacroce and Plate were charged with conspiracy to commit murder for the 1974 killing of Charlie Calise. Fradiano stated that he met with Plate in California in 1976 and he asked Plate about getting a loan for one of his associates, but Plate informed Fradiano that Dellacroce wouldn't allow it because it would encroach on other families' territories. That's when Fradiano claims that Plate confided in him about the Calise murder. The information that Fradiano provided to the NYPD and other law enforcement agencies would go on to get numerous high-ranking mobsters indicted.
Soon, Dellacroce would become wary of Plate's possibility to cooperate. In addition to this, he knew his chances of beating the case would be greatly improved if he was tried alone, because Plate was the only common denominator between him and Calise. A few months later, in August 1979, John Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero headed to Miami. Around the same time that Gotti and Ruggiero were in Miami, Tony Plate disappeared and was never seen again.
Tony Plate and a friend of his had driven somewhere to run an errand. Neither Plate, his friend, nor his car were ever found.
After the disappearance of Plate, the case against Dellacroce crumbled and he was acquitted of all charges.
For years, one of Dellacroce's staunchest rivals was Bonanno family boss Carmine Galante. Galante had been ordering the murders of Gambino members, attacking Gambino family businesses, and aiming to become the boss of bosses. When the governing body of the Mafia known as the Commission had enough of Galante's antics, Dellacroce and his faction would mastermind the killing of Galante along with a faction of the Bonanno family. On July 12, 1979, Galante was shot dead as he ate lunch at the Joe and Mary restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn. Shortly afterwards, one of the alleged assassins of Galante, a Bonanno capo named Bruno Indelicato, was caught on surveillance at the Ravenite Club, meeting with several Gambino members, including Dellacroce.
Less than a year later, in March of 1980, Dellacroce was one of 8 mobsters who were indicted for contempt of grand jury for refusing to answer questions about the Galante killing.
One of those indicted was his son, Armand. Armand Dellacroce was sentenced to a year in prison for refusing to testify in front of a grand jury which was investigating the slaying of Carmine Galante. In 1980, a law enforcement official was quoted as saying, "Castellano doesn't call the shots that count. The man that does is Dellacroce. He's got the firepower, the army of enforcers that keeps the family in line."
By the early 1980s, many of the Gambinos were growing displeased with Castellano's rule. They saw him as greedy and uninvolved with the guys in the streets who were putting in all the work for him and calling shots from the comfort of his mansion in Staten Island. When Castellano increased his kickbacks from the usual 10% up to 15%, even more dissent in the family built. In violation of the boss's rule of no drug dealing, John Gotti and his crew were heavily involved with drug trafficking behind the boss's back. Law enforcement created Operation Acorn to battle organized crime, and their main focus was Aniello Dellacroce. Italian-speaking detectives had tried to rent apartments near the Ravenite as observation sites, but suspicious Italian landlords wouldn't rent to them. Detectives got a break when they discovered that at least one building on Mulberry Street, which happened to be just across from the Ravenite, was owned by a Chinese businessman. They paid the landlord to rent an apartment and set up in an apartment which had a direct view of the Ravenite. Neil also had a German Shepherd guard dog named Duke, which lived inside of the Ravenite. Duke had presented a problem for detectives who were trying to plant a bug in the Ravenite, so they came up with a plan to feed him meatballs laced with tranquilizer. However, the Ravenite crew was ever vigilant about surveillance and had found several bugs planted in the club. When Neil's men noticed detectives hiding in the trunk of cars directly in front of the Ravenite in order to eavesdrop on conversations, Neil had his men open a fire hydrant and spray the vehicles to force them out of the car.
In 1981, the FBI had planted a bug in Angelo Ruggiero's home. Ruggiero had thought the home was a safe place to discuss business because the home was in his daughter's name, but he was sorely mistaken. For years, the FBI had recorded Ruggiero and other Gambino members on tape discussing various criminal activities such as loan sharking and drug dealing. Heavy surveillance of the Ravenite continued. When authorities discovered that Dellacroce, Gotti, and other members were carrying out conversations in the apartment above the Ravenite, they planted a bug which captured numerous incriminating conversations. In 1983, Ruggiero was arrested along with 6 of his associates, one of which included John Gotti's brother, Gene. The incriminating evidence gathered from Ruggiero's home gave the feds cause to plant a bug in Paul Castellano's home. By now, the physically declining Dellacroce had become cancer-stricken, yet continued to make himself available to his subordinates and was still involved in the day-to-day operations. By 1984, a mountain of evidence against New York's 5 mafia families had been gathered, and the walls were beginning to close in on Dellacroce and the Gambinos. In November of 1984, Dellacroce was indicted on income tax evasion charges. Then, in February of 1985, Dellacroce was indicted along with Paul Castellano and numerous other mafia bosses on charges of racketeering, which would result in a major case against organized crime known as the Mafia Commission Trial. Then, just a month later, in March of 1985, Dellacroce was one of 10 Gambino family members charged with federal RICO conspiracy and related counts, along with his son Armand, John Gotti, and Angelo Ruggiero. Neil hired the powerful New York attorney Barry Slotnick, who had represented other mobsters like Joe Colombo and would later represent John Gotti. After more than 50 years of a life of crime, up to this point, Dellacroce had only spent 6 years in prison. From 1984 to 1985, boss Paul Castellano was hit with a 78-count indictment.
In June of 1985, Ruggiero managed to get his hands on the FBI tapes. When Castellano heard about the tapes, he went to Dellacroce and demanded that they be handed over to him. Gotti and the rest of his crew were on those tapes bad-mouthing Castellano and discussing drug dealing, and they knew it would effectively be a death sentence for all of them if Castellano got a hold of those tapes. Dellacroce had mediated the situation and tried to placate Castellano as long as he could to protect his underlings. Dellacroce claimed that Ruggiero was on those tapes saying a lot of personal things that he was embarrassed about and didn't want anyone else to hear.
These tapes were even more detrimental to John Gotti. He was recorded on tape insulting Dellacroce for some of his decisions. When an NYPD detective told Gotti that Dellacroce wouldn't be happy about that, the detective said that this was the only time he ever saw Gotti look remorseful. Despite his gossip and loose lips, Gotti still had a great respect for Dellacroce.
Around this time, John Gotti asked Dellacroce for permission to kill Castellano, but Dellacroce wouldn't allow it, as killing a boss without approval from the governing body of the mafia known as the Commission would break the rules of La Cosa Nostra. The old school Dellacroce was caught on tape reminding his pupil Gotti about the rules of La Cosa Nostra.
That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what an usher. An usher means that the boss is your boss. Understand? The boss is a boss. What the f*** is a boss? We might as well make anybody else a f***ing criminal.
Dellacroce was accused of leading a criminal enterprise for the past 18 years, which was involved in various different rackets, from drug dealing and loan sharking to extortion and murder.
In December of 1985, Armand Dellacroce pleaded guilty to racketeering and conspiracy charges and was facing 20 years in jail, but before he could be sentenced, he went on the run. Aniello Dellacroce, who was now gravely ill with cancer and heart disease, was facing numerous indictments, but he would never serve a single day in prison on any of the 3 cases that were brought against him back to back within a few months of each other. His illnesses caught up with him and he died on December 2nd, 1985 at the age of 71. Shortly before his death, the sickly Dellacroce checked into the Mary Immaculate Hospital in Queens under the name Timothy O'Neill.
While Castellano was free on bail, he didn't attend Dellacroce's funeral, which incensed the other Gambino members, who saw it as a great insult for him not to pay respects to his own underboss and to the man that they idolized. Dellacroce's death now paved the way for his followers to take action against Castellano.
Soon after Dellacroce's passing, John Gotti and his 2 right-hand men, Frank DeChico and Sammy The Bull Gravano, would devise a plot to kill Castellano. 2 weeks later, they put their plan into motion. On December 16, 1985, Castellano and his underboss, Tommy Bellotti, were gunned down by hitmen in front of Sparks Steakhouse as they exited their vehicle. Soon after Castellano's death, John Gotti would take over as boss and would appoint Frank DeChico as his underboss. After DeChico was killed by a car bomb, Sammy The Bull Gravano would eventually become Gotti's underboss.
Dellacroce's death inadvertently paved the way for the most volatile period in the history of the Gambino family. John Gotti would prove to be better suited as a subordinate under Dellacroce's guidance than he would as a boss. The Gambino family under Gotti's leadership would have disastrous results and would lead to the entire New York Mafia being crippled.
On March 4th, 1988, Neil's son Armand, who had been hiding out in the Poconos since skipping his sentencing hearing in 1986, passed away at a Poconos hospital at the age of 32. Armand was a heavy cocaine and alcohol user and had also contracted AIDS. His cause of death was listed as cirrhosis of the liver.
While Aniello Dellacroce never obtained the title of boss and isn't a household name to the general public or even to some casual mob fans, the footprint he left behind can't be overstated. A man who came up the right way by doing his time, making his bones, and abiding by the rules, Aniello Dellacroce was the embodiment of a full-blooded mafioso. Being schooled by one of the most savage gangsters of all time in Albert Anastasia, and one of the greatest criminal masterminds we've seen in Carlo Gambino, led to Dellacroce becoming a well-rounded balance of prominent gangster qualities. He personified the macho culture of the mafia with his raw toughness and cold stare that could unnerve even the most hardcore of men. From the underworld to the business world, most individuals have a ceiling within the ranks of their organization. Dellacroce may have optimized his qualities as a second in command and was better suited for that position than he was to be boss. As an elder statesman, he led crews of thugs and killers who respected his authority and obeyed his direction. Aniello Dellacroce was a gangster's gangster and a towering vice president in the mafia underworld.